Hello, what is going on, guys? Hockey Guy 1 here. Welcome to my review of The Dark Knight Rises. So, The Dark Knight Rises is directed by Christopher Nolan and stars Christian Bale, Michael Caine, Gary Oldman, Morgan Freeman, Anne Hathaway, Tom Hardy, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and Marion Cotillard. So the story basically takes place 8 years after the last movie, where Bane wants to fulfill Ra's al Ghul's destiny by taking over and destroying Gotham. And basically, Commissioner Gordon thinks he needs Batman to come back out. So he tries to convince him, and eventually, once he does come back out, police forces obviously aren't really on his side, as they are going after him because of the last movie he's ending, and as well as he just thinks that they're kind of a bad person because of what he did in the last movie, and basically Batman's out there to try and stop Bane, and then eventually does team up with Catwoman, but eventually it does lead into this trap where Bane does end up breaking Batman and sending him into this underground prison where he has to try and get out of it before Bane completely destroys Gotham with this bomb. So the story is very good. It does have a good connection with the last movie as of how this has taken place 8 years after that, and how they're still kind of mad at Batman because of the ending of the last movie. And I do think that making that gives it a good connection to the last movie, and it feels like it's moving along with the trilogy pretty well. And I do feel like that this movie's overall story makes sense, as basically it's basically like Bane, who's basically portraying a terrorist in this, who wants to like blow up Gotham City, and Batman has to try and get there to stop him before he does so. And I do feel like just this kind of movie does really work for us, and I do think that it works for Batman, as basically it's just a movie where he has to try and get it to Bane in time before he fully blows it up. And I do think that this gives it a lot of realistic feelings to this movie, as it could very well happen in real life, and just how much it is, and it makes it feel very realistic, and it's kind of like a new style to comic book movies. And I do think that as a continuation to the last movie, it makes sense, as it even goes back to elements from Batman Begins by mentioning how he wants to fulfill Ra's al Ghul's destiny. So the story structure of this movie is really good. You basically got the first act, which starts with Commissioner Gordon deciding not to tell his speech until like a different kind of speech with Harvey Dent, because it kind of connects back to the last movie where he didn't really want to ruin Harvey's reputation, which is basically the whole reason why Batman decided to turn himself in for Harvey Dent. And I do think that it's pretty good way to open it, as it connects immediately back to the last movie, as it kind of like reminds you of that. And then basically the rest of it's kind of like Bane is captured, and then she's kind of part of his plan, so she does kind of just go after him and basically make the plane crash. And it's a pretty big way to introduce your villain, so I do feel like it's a pretty good way to show it, as it kind of shows how intimidating he is just right off the bat. And I do think that is a good way to introduce his whole character, and as well as just the whole thing is kind of shows part of his plan. And then there's the second act, which basically shows him like part of his plan, and basically trying to stop off. And basically, eventually, Batman does come out in it, and police force go after him, and as well as Catwoman. And I just feel like that it's pretty well done, and for the most part. And then eventually there's the whole thing where Catwoman unintentionally like leads him into Bane's trap, and I do think that's pretty much moves along the second act pretty well, and shows him breaking him, then shows him back to the underground prison basically, and then basically Bane goes there, turns Gotham into chaos after he tells them the truth about Harvey Dent, and basically says that there's a bomb that's going to be detonated, and he does eventually like trap the whole Gotham City Police Department in it. like underground, and it basically turns into whole chaos as it's basically run by the people now, and it's basically just chaos and how it works. Like you can see how it kind of works for how there's only two whole things that can happen if there's a crime, then and the way the crimes are pretty much unfair. So like you can see what happens when a whole city turns into chaos, which kind of makes it feel more realistic. And I do really like how this movie does that, and I do think that it is a pretty good way to like continue the realistic feeling of the whole trilogy as a whole. And I do think that it makes sense for it, and as well as just the whole thing there, and then basically eventually showing Batman going through all this determination to try and get out of this pit, with Bruce eventually getting out of the pit after a while, and then basically tries to go back to Gotham, and then that kind of like kickstarts the third act where he basically teams up with Catwoman and basically the police force to try and stop Bane from basically detonating this bomb that's going to completely destroy Gotham City. And it's just a really good way to set it up about. I mean, there's one thing I didn't really like about it, but once he kind of like realized that there was no way that he can stop the detonation, is basically it's in the villain's hand, then I do think that his decision makes sense as he goes up to sacrifice himself, as basically he goes into the bat and brings up this bomb and brings it far away from Gotham, and basically sacrifices his whole life for Gotham City, which is a pretty good way to send him off. And then it kind of gets to the whole thing where you have Blake basically resigning from Gotham City Police Department as a detective, and basically he kind of being referred to as Robin, and there's that, but I kind of think that that's a reference. Doesn't really add that much, but I think that it's just a cool kind of reference. And then there's kind of the whole thing where Alfred sees Bruce with Selina at the end, and I mean that's kind of a thing where you can just really let the audience decide what happens, as doesn't really explain. So that's kind of how it is. You just try and see the audience say what happens. So I kind of see it as that, and I do think that that's a pretty good way to kind of end off the trilogy where you kind of have the audience decide what happens. And I do think that was a pretty suiting ending for this, as you know, have that, and it kind of feels like a whole conclusion to this trilogy after Gotham is saved, and Alfred kind of has to run Wayne. The pacing in this movie is really good. It does come out as 2 hours and 45 minutes, which does come out as the longest in the trilogy, but it does feel like the film is pretty much just as long as those other two. It does feel like the film connects with each other, and each scene does connect with each other for the most part, as it does feel like the pacing is pretty well done, as it does feel like this movie does have each scene connect with each other, basically making the film feel like it should be that runtime. The action in this film is really good, as always says. Basically, I do like how practical everything is, and basically just most of the scenes do feel like they do serve a purpose, so each action scene does feel really good in the case of story-wise, and just how fun they are to watch. And basically, kind of Batman coming out, he's getting chased by the police officers, which has a huge chase scene, and I do really like that, as it feels like it serves a purpose, basically connecting to the last movie, as police officers don't really like him. And then, like, when he's kind of like fighting alongside Catwoman against these people near like the 45-minute mark, and I just feel like that was pretty good, as that kind of like shows the first team up between Catwoman and Batman, and I think that it's pretty good, as it feels pretty fun. It does make sense story-wise, and as they're kind of like fighting these police forces, and I feel like that action scene in specific is really good. And then there's also the first scene where Batman and Bane fight each other, as that scene is really good, as basically, it's very set up well in the story where Batman ends up getting lured right into Bane's trap, and then he end up fighting him for a while, and basically showing how strong Bane is as he pretty much manhandles Batman and ends up breaking his back and sending him into this underground prison. And basically, I do really like that as that does show how strong Bane is as a character, and basically serves a purpose in the story as it's basically sets up Bane's plan so Gotham's wide open without any Batman, and I do feel like it makes sense in that kind of way. And then there's also the kind of scene where Bane kind of like traps the police forces underground, and it's basically he just searches first, and it basically shows how big of a plan Bane's plan is. And there's also the scene where Batman eventually comes back and sends a whole revolt against Bane and fights him along with police forces and Catwoman fighting these other people. And I do feel like that scene, as well being the climax, is really good, as it feels like it was leading up all the way to this point, and it feels like it was paid off well, as this action scene was really fun. Seeing Batman and Bane fight each other, and Batman eventually yelling things like "Where's the trigger?" in his voice, and it does feel like that scene is really good, as it feels like that it served a purpose, and basically it felt like this was what the entire movie was leading up to, and it was a payoff. And especially when Batman sacrifices himself for Gotham, that whole scene there, this action scene is what really stood out to me, as that basically showed how much Batman started to care about Gotham. Bruce Wayne, or Batman as a character, is written very well, as he's basically written as this broken down character from the last movie, and I do feel like that they did a pretty good job with writing his character, as basically he's broken down for a good reason. I mean, Gotham isn't really on his side anymore, as basically the ending of the last movie, where he ended up killing Harvey Dent and basically turned himself in for a lot of things Harvey Dent did. And I just feel like just that makes sense for him to be a broken down character, as he wouldn't really want to go out as anymore. And then eventually, when he is convinced they come out, she ends up getting sent to this underground prison after his back broke. I mean, just seeing his whole determination just to get out of that pit is what really stood out to me with Bruce Wayne's character. And I do think that they do a pretty good job in growing Bruce Wayne as a character rather than just his Batman side in this movie. And I do think that just showing his whole determination of him getting out of this underground prison does make sense, as it is pretty well done to show how much he is determined to try and go save Gotham. And eventually, when he gets out, and then fights Bane, you can see how he does end up deciding to sacrifice himself for Gotham, which just shows how much he cares about Gotham, which kind of brings his character arc to an end, as he does sacrifice himself for Gotham by almost blowing himself up. And basically, the ending does kind of show him with Selena Kyle. You don't really know if that's real or not, so I would call him dead, as I'm guessing. As to me, I'd probably, as it basically, that ending is where it has to let the audience decide, and I do feel like that, he's probably dead. And as it's shown up, as you don't really see him, never really survived it. And so I do feel like that does bring his character arc to an end, and basically tries to show how he cares about Gotham. And I do feel like just this whole character arc ending is the perfect way to do it. Alfred doesn't really have as big as a role in this movie as he does the other two, but I do feel like the way they wrote his character made sense, as basically he doesn't really want to bear another Wayne, so he doesn't really want to stay with Bruce anymore after he decides to go after Bane, because he doesn't really feel like Bruce is strong enough to fight Bane. And it does kind of make sense, as he doesn't really want anything bad to happen to Bruce, and so he decides to resign to save him because he doesn't really feel like he's strong enough to fight Bane, so he doesn't really want to have trouble with Bruce. Commissioner Gordon is very well written again, as kind of like the last movie, he doesn't really want to tell anyone about Harvey Dent, which again connects to the last movie, and I do feel like it makes sense as it is pretty well done, as basically it's Commissioner Gordon doesn't really want to ruin Harvey Dent, and I do feel like she is pretty well written as a character, as basically does get injured, but also still kind of like tries to help with all the police forces, and basically I do feel like it's very well written in that kind of case, as he may have accidentally made Bane's plan work with the whole Harvey Dent kind of speech, accidentally giving that up, and also the whole thing where he tells all the police officers to go after Bane in one spot and basically straps the whole police force under him. And it does seem kind of like a plot coincidence, but like you can kind of understand why in this case, as basically Bane is trying to blow up the city and he wants to go after him because he's kind of ruining the city. I do feel like that does make sense, and it's just kind of like a character mistake they did kind of learn on later in the movie, and he also does kind of help in the climaxes. He's on this kind of truck thing, and basically kind of helps out during the climax a bit, and I do feel like that it does make sense, as you can see how much his character has grown by the end of this film. Lucius Fox, kind of like Alfred, doesn't really have as big as a role in this movie as he did in the other two, but he still kind of like makes some new tech for Batman, and basically kind of like helps him with some of the tech, and even going back to like the place in the Dark Knight to try and help with some tech, and I do feel like that makes sense for this movie, as Lucius Fox doesn't really need to have as big as a role in this movie, as isn't really focused on tech as much, but like when they kind of like show some of the new tech, she does show up and kind of like give it to him, and I do feel like that does kind of work for him. John Blake is a pretty well written character, and he's basically this detective for like the Gotham City Police Department, and basically as his job, he does end up arresting Selina Kyle, and basically it does do a lot in this movie. I mean, he is pretty much this detective who she's good in Batman, and he doesn't really see why people are really that against him. He thinks it's kind of random that all of a sudden they're against him. And I do feel like that he's a pretty well-written character for what he is, as basically he is facing this character who's this detective. He's helping out, he even like helps out a bunch of people, kind of like showing how compelling he is, like trying to help these kids get across this bridge at all costs, even if it means it blows. And I do feel like that makes a pretty compelling character. And then basically something else about his character is just that how we can like see his stress coming in, and I do feel like he's pretty well written in that kind of case, but as a detective, he definitely sees things coming, and he does try to like see the situation better, and does try. And even at the end, when they can like repeal him as a Robin, this is his first name. I mean, it just kind of seems like it was a reference thrown in there, but man, it's not really the end. I don't really think it's that bad though. Selina Kyle, or Catwoman, is basically like this anti-hero, and I feel like she's pretty well written. They like introduced her by basically showing her to steal this valuable item from Bruce Wayne, and I do think that kind of like sets out the case, kind of makes her look like she's a villain. And she does kind of like have decisions. She doesn't really agree with Batman very often, like the no guns kind of rule kind of thing. And I do think that it's pretty well written for she is, as she is kind of like this anti-hero. And then she does also kind of show her like how much she does kind of care for Gotham, and she does help people out when they're not really doing fine after Bane that completely took it over. And then she does eventually teams up with Batman in the climax, which kind of like shows a character development of trust with him, despite not really agreeing with what he says. And I do think that makes sense for this movie, as they do kind of grow some sort of relationship with her and Bruce, and as they don't really know if she trusts her or not, and I feel like that they trust each other more throughout this movie, as they do eventually team up by the climax, and they didn't really trust each other at first, and I just feel like that relationship was pretty well developed for the most part. Bane is a very intimidating villain. I mean, he's very strong, and it really shows throughout this movie, and as well as just his whole entire plan makes sense as basically what his plan is, and he wants to try and take over Gotham, but he does have a lot to, like, basically he tries to send Commissioner Gordon into a trap and to retrieve kind of this latter thing, and then as well as he tries to lure Batman into a trap and then break him, send him into an underground prison where she's basically led straight into the city and can easily take over it, and then basically wants to blow it up, and then kind of like reveals the world about Harvey Dent with the thing that he got from Commissioner Gordon earlier. And I think his plan is what makes him really intimidating, as there's so much to his plan that you don't really know what's gonna happen, and I feel like that they do a really good job kind of like showing his plan. The acting is very good. All the returning actors, like Christian Bale, still is really good. Still kind of like feels like the character. He's still got it in this movie. Then Gary Oldman, same thing can go for him. He still feels like the character, and as well as Morgan Freeman and Michael Caine, both of them still feeling like their characters that they're playing. And then there's also new actors like Anne Hathaway playing Catwoman, really feeling like the character in each delivery of her line. And then Tom Hardy gives like this deep voice and it kind of makes him feel really intimidating and feel like Bane. And I really like the voice he chose for that, and it just made him very intimidating. Visual effects are mostly practical. Once again, I mean, he does literally drop a plane out of the air, and I do feel like that was very good for how they did that, as basically, he dropped the plane out of the sky, just made it more practical, and it still looked pretty good. And I do think that it worked for the most part, and as well as most of the fire effects looked fine, and I do think he did a good job with the visual effects. Cinematography is very good. Basically, they do a lot in this film is they do show a lot of close-ups because they're trying to show the characters' emotions a lot, and I do feel like they make sense for those moments, as basically it makes sense for them to want to show their emotions, as it does make sense, because this movie is very serious and will show the characters' emotions a lot of times, and I do feel like it works for that. And as well as when they show the landscape of scene, like when Bane completely like blew up the whole area of Gotham that's trapped the police underneath the ground. Like when they used the cinematography for that scene, it looked very good, as it basically showed around Gotham to show everywhere where he blew up, and I do feel like that was a very good scene of the cinematography. The lighting, while not used as much as the previous two, as most of this is in day, unlike the previous two, but when they did use it, it's fine. I mean, you can still see what's going on when it's nighttime, so I feel like they did a pretty good job with it. The editing is very good, as when it comes from one shot to another, it feels smooth, and especially in action scenes, it feels smooth, as when it comes from one shot to another, it still kind of like feels like it's intense in the action, and it feels fine. And it's just when it transitions from one scene to another, it works. Like after Batman got his back broken, they basically transitioned Blackout and then showed him inside the underground prison, and I feel like that transition really works for the moment, as it made sense, as he was basically sleeping until he got there, and I do feel like it makes sense for the movie. The costume designs are very good. Obviously, they brought back the same Batman suit from the last movie, so basically same thoughts there. And then there's Bane's costume, which is very good. I mean, not necessarily resemblance to the comics, but I do feel like it looks fine. I mean, it has the intimidating look with the whole kind of vest thing, and as well as the mask across his face looks pretty intimidating, and I do feel like it's pretty good modern take with the Bane costume, and the same thing with Catwoman. That feels like a modern version of a Catwoman costume, and it looks fine on screen. The set designs are pretty good, and they did use a lot of the sets from the last movie, and I do feel like those still look fine, and as well as the rebuilt Wayne Manor looks fine as well. And as well as just the whole new places that they discovered in Gotham City look fine, and as well as there's this new set, the underground prison. Like, I really liked the looks of that set, as it's basically like deep underground, and it works for movie and that. And I do like how they did that kind of idea of the underground prison and kind of making it look good. And it kind of like shows how it kind of looks, and basically you can see how it's a thing that barely anyone can really get out of. The score is really good. Each scene I kind of like uses the score, it fits the moments, and I do feel like it works for each moment that it uses, as most of the time that's the tone of the movie is pretty dark, so the score is definitely going to be a bit smoothing and feel like it's a lot more dark, and it ends up feeling like the moment. That said, I do think this movie has some negatives. Like, the only thing I didn't really like about the story is the kind of random reveal that Miranda Tate was Talia al Ghul all along, and I do really think that made sense. It didn't really seem like this movie was setting up any twist villain beforehand, and it didn't really feel like it needed to be here, as it didn't really add anything to the story outside of she had the detonator, and that's about it. And it didn't really help when the movie wasn't really setting anything up like a twist villain, and it didn't really add anything to it outside of the detonator thing, which does kind of tie into Talia al Ghul's character in general. Like, it didn't really make sense. The only thing they really say about her is that she is the kid of Ra's al Ghul, and that's about it. And I don't really think that they should have done that with Miranda Tate or Talia al Ghul. Like, it didn't make sense for the movie. It was just kind of a random change all of a sudden, that it felt like it was a last-minute decision and just didn't really tie in well with the rest of the movie. So overall, The Dark Knight Rises may not be as good as The Dark Knight, but I still think it's a fantastic movie and an overall fantastic conclusion to the Dark Knight trilogy. So I'm going to give The Dark Knight Rises a 9 out of 10. That was my review of The Dark Knight Rises. What are your thoughts on The Dark Knight Rises? Tell me in the comments below. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.